We're often told hard work pays off, that talent rises to the top, that success is earned. That's meritocracy. The idea that ability and effort, not privilege or birthright, determine who succeeds and who doesn't. But are we really offered a level playing field? Or are people's futures shaped more by class, race, geography, and other factors beyond their control? In other words, is earned success an illusion? In this episode of Doha Debates, we're joined by experts, global thinkers, each with their own take on this issue.
Meritocracy has become the principal obstacle to equality of opportunity, at least in the rich countries of the world.
Meritocracy is pretty real. If we actually had open borders where anyone in the world could work anywhere, that would be the true essence of meritocracy.
So meritocracy is a belief, a system in which it is assumed that people have the opportunity solely on the basis of their merit. Now, the reality, though, is that people experience biases and discrimination across many different aspects of their identity, and therefore it means that it isn't actually a level playing field.
Meritocracy can work if the most qualified people are making decisions about the shape and direction of society.
Their perspectives will be explored and questioned in a Majlis-style debate grounded in understanding and a search for truth. Watching over all of this will be a group of university students and recent graduates. They come from different universities in Qatar Foundation's Education City and beyond, and have been preparing for this debate.
Well, life is not fair. We should not be doing any sort of programs or policies that equalize outcome, because then that creates injustice for those who actually are better and smarter. But what we can do is equalize opportunity.
But I don't think that anybody can break into the system. I think the system in a lot of ways ensures that certain people stay out. And if somebody is trying to rise up, they put hurdles in their way because they want to maintain the status quo as is.
I think meritocracy gives you the platform and the opportunity to prove yourself, you as an individual versus the world.
I used to be very motivated before by what it used to be meritocracy. But now that I have graduated from university and I'm here applying for jobs, I feel the most stressed out. You see other people succeed and it hurts you.
The system that we have now is not perfect, but what we have is the best possible situation where people are actually able to use their skills to proceed in life. If you are valuable, you will be valued.
But it's not based off of who provides the most value to society. It's based off of who provides the most value to the market. Those are two very different things, right?
After our guests finish their debates, the students will reflect and deliberate before returning with their own insights, ready to challenge, agree, or offer entirely new perspectives. I'm Darina Guido, and this is Doha Debates. A warm welcome to you all. Thanks so much for your time and thanks for joining us. Daniel, you say not only does meritocracy not exist, the very idea of it is dangerous. Why?
Well, meritocracy promises that you can get ahead based on your own accomplishments. But there are three inputs to accomplishments. There's effort, there's talent, and there's training. And the problem we face today is that the generation that won the last meritocratic competition has an unmatched ability and taste for training its children. And so meritocracy has become a mechanism for transmitting privilege down through the generations of rich families.
Bryan, where do you see meritocracy working well today, and where is it falling short, perhaps?
To start with, it's falling short mainly internationally because for all their meritocratic pretensions, most governments on earth very strictly regulate immigration so that most talent isn't allowed to actually go to wherever it would be most able to succeed. In terms of where it's most succeeding, I would say in business, the tech sector. These are the areas that are revolutionizing the world, and these are places where we really do see the best and the brightest doing amazing things.
Poornima, weigh in on this.
So when we think about meritocracy, we're assuming that people have the opportunities to be hired, to be promoted in our organizations purely on the basis of their skills, their competencies, their effort. But the reality we have to ask is, well, how do we define merit in itself? Isn't the very concept of merit something that is socially constructed and one that actually holds quite a lot of bias within it?
I worry that we're defining meritocracy and even just success as something that by definition has to be a very scarce good, and it doesn't have to be. If we define success as allowing each individual to pursue their interests, their aptitude, allow whatever skills, interests they have to flourish and reward that accordingly, then rather than focus purely on the input side, we can define our social contract in a way in which we're enabling merit to take many different forms.
So what does meritocracy mean to you?
Well, formally defined, we would say it's a system that rewards achievement. But again, we're talking about that from the narrow perspective of success within either how you are selected for an academic training or degree, what jobs you attain or are able to acquire in society, or what leadership positions you attain in the professional world.
Our meritocracy measures merit by the ability to command a high wage in the labor market. So in my own country, in the United States, the richest 1% of households owe 3/4 of their income to selling their labor. So what it is to have merit, as our society defines it, is to have skills that you can sell for a very high price. And that might be a mistake. And it might be damaging. My own view is it's damaging not just to those who are excluded, but it's actually damaging to those who seem to win the competition because they're forced to exploit themselves to get rich.
Poornima, you agree with what Daniel is saying? And how do you see meritocracy?
So I see meritocracy as a belief system in which there are a lot of assumptions there, that people have fair opportunities and that someone who is hired into a role, promoted into a leadership position, is done and has achieved that purely on the basis of merit. But that assumption is deeply flawed.
Bryan, I mean, is the goal of meritocracy to create an equal society or to create a fair one?
Yeah, definitely not an equal society because everyone doesn't have the same amount of merit. We should think about meritocracy as an ideal rather than a description of any particular world. But the goal, of course, is to have a society that is, first of all, fair, but also another big part of meritocracy is just productive. There are plenty of people who believe in meritocracy and say, well, I don't care whether it's fair or not. What I care is that it leads to a world where we have fantastic progress. I would actually go further and say, and that's also fair. A world where we just randomly hand out money based upon nothing is a less fair society than one where we base it upon actual performance. The same way that if the Olympics were to go and say, let's just hand out the medals randomly, I'd say that's a very unfair world. As to whether or not it also encourages people to work harder, yeah, it does. But even if that wasn't true, should you just hand out the gold medal randomly? I'd say no.
There is a level of meritocracy wherever you are in the world. I think that wherever you may be, there is a level of success that you can attain based on your merit. How that looks is going to be different where you are in the world, of course, but not everybody needs to be a billionaire, not everyone needs to be a trillionaire, not everybody needs to be a tech CEO, right?
Ideally, it would be nice to have a system which rewarded you on the basis of how much effort you put in, but we just have to push against and really expand what we consider to be merits, what we consider to be valuable to the society.
Parag, are equality and fairness the same thing? Do you equate them with each other?
No, not necessarily. With equality, we're speaking about primarily equality of opportunity, right? Do people have access to those social services, to education and so forth that can allow them, again, to flourish, to pursue the ends that they want to pursue in society? With fairness, very often we're talking about the outcomes, right? The distribution of benefits and the equity within a society more broadly. And I think that that's where we have to think about meritocracy not merely as one set of patterns within a society treated like a marketplace versus a society which is something much broader, in which we think about, again, governance, rules, equity of outcomes, benefits more broadly. And that's where issues of fairness come in, both on the input side and the output side. And again, no society is perfect. No society has gotten there yet.
Daniel, do you agree with what Parag has to say?
Well, I think certainly scarcity at the top is extremely damaging to a society. But I think we have to understand that there's a nuance to the way in which meritocracy has interacted with scarcity. So take the following very striking contrast. Compare the world today to the world 200 years ago in 1820. In almost every country in the world, there is substantially more equality than there was then along lines of race, or gender or caste or sexual orientation. There's still an enormous amount of inequality along those dimensions, but the world is transformatively more equal now than it was in 1820. Meritocracy explains why we have less hierarchy along race or gender lines, because everybody has talent and effort, but it also explains why we have more inequality along economic lines, because meritocracy has dramatically distorted the returns to a narrow set of capacities and produced a winner-take-all competition economically.
To say that there could ever be anything other than extreme scarcity at the top is crazy. The top, by definition, can only have a few people because that's the way that we find it. But if we're focusing on comparing the world of today, the world of 1820, say it gives us an illustration of how stupid it is to worry about equality. No one would, in their right mind, would want to go back to 1820 because of the horrible misery and suffering. It's not just that things there's a difference in equality, it's that absolute living standards are vastly higher. And I say that's the reasonable thing to be focused on. What I thought Dan was going to say, actually, is that it's thanks to meritocracy that we've had so much economic growth, which would be a very sensible thing to say.
First of all, we have to decide what the top looks like. We can have a spiky, fine, pointy peak, or we can have a broad plateau. And there are lots of reasons to favor a broad plateau over a spiky, fine peak, including for those at the top. When you have fractal inequality, where there's more inequality in the United States today, for example, within the top 5% of the income distribution than in the income distribution as a whole, you create extremely damaging competition among the privileged. But you also create enormous exclusion for everybody else. So that's the first point. The second point on economic growth, it may also be an achievement that has a shelf life, and we may be reaching its best before date. It's not clear that our civilization can sustain growth of the sort we've had for the past 200 years into the next 200 years without destroying ourselves environmentally, socially, and also spiritually.
If anything, it was a strange debate because I don't think either Professor Markovits or the fellow panelist who is also opposed to meritocracy, I don't think they're really opposed to meritocracy per se. Now, they may be opposed to, say, inequalities in terms of how people are raised or their starting positions, which I think even the most pro-meritocratic person would agree with. So I would have said that I'm opposed to Markovits' worldview, but in reality, I think we kind of see eye to eye in terms of the end result. I think we just both disagree on how to achieve meritocracy, but we both agree that meritocracy is a great ideal in and of itself.
Poornima, let's peel back the layers a little bit more. Is inequality a feature, or is it a flaw in a real, true merit-based society?
So first of all, I'd like to maybe move to inequity rather than inequality. With equality, we assume that we're giving everyone, regardless of who they are, the very same tools, opportunities, access to resources. With equity, we take those differences into account. And that is really the danger of meritocracy, that if we assume that society is indeed meritocratic, then for those who are sitting in positions of power, decision-making positions, then they assume that the inequity that we see, the fact that there's inequality, that people don't have those same access to resources, is because they don't have the talent, they don't have the skills, or they're not putting in enough effort. And that's the danger of it, because we stop seeing that our very system structures are actually built and constructed in a way that favors some and doesn't favor others.
I'll say the truth, as someone who's coming from the African continent, the leaders do not want to fix any of the systems. The leaders will not say, okay, let's try to improve the situation, let's try to improve conditions so that we have better outcomes. And this is where individual agency then comes in, because you will not rely on the system, you will rely on yourself, on your hands, and your own will to actually determine your fate.
I live in Singapore, and that is a place where, no doubt, has been historically identified as a place where very much gravitates towards your academic achievements being a precursor, being a prerequisite to advancing into leadership positions. And yet now they're saying, well, let's broaden that aperture. Let's look at what your volunteerism is, what your civic contributions have been, and other kinds of other demonstrations of leadership rather than simply what you've done as an individual. And you can define or redefine or broaden those criteria on the input side of leadership, and then on the output side, where the government actually is measuring to what extent a leader and through their decisions has actually brought benefit to the public while serving in the civil service, for example. So redefining along the way what we even mean by merit, what we mean by achievement, away from merely your personal aptitude in an abstract academic sense to rather what your living, ongoing contributions are to society is one way we can go about that.
as a Singaporean, having lived in Singapore and now who lives in Copenhagen, right, I've seen a real contrast in how we look at success and what that means to people. You know, growing up in Singapore was all about the academic achievement, and also that in itself was one that if you had the opportunity to get extra tutoring, you had an advantage. If you went to the better schools, if you happened to live in a catchment area, you know, and that had better schools, then you had access to those opportunities. But then now I live in Copenhagen, in Denmark, and it's a very different system, a different way of looking and defining success in itself. Success isn't really about reaching the top in those few positions. It's more about the balance in life. And it was a refreshing change coming from a society that valued, yes, education, but also valued wealth, to actually living in a society that values just being human. And interestingly, it's one of the most competitive countries in the world. And so you also have to ask yourself, some of the things that we make assumptions on around economic growth, around competitiveness, does it necessarily come at a cost to some of the things that are important to our lives? Peace of mind, living in a safe environment, feeling that deep sense of contentment.
To be honest. I mean, I hate acting like Scandinavian countries are utopian states. Yeah, really. It's ridiculous.
This is ridiculous.
We could use like some of that like perspective.
She's just saying that there's no merit. We can improve merit.
We have to redefine
You're on the
merit.
same side as me, you know? You're not making anything. You're not opposing the system.
We all kind of agree that merit's a good ideal, that you should be judged based on what you do. The disagreement is really on how to achieve it. So some would argue that we need to have equity policies to determine that. I would argue that we have to have equality of opportunity, equality of rights under the law, which I think is a better way to correct things and have someone take away from someone who was in a good position towards someone who was in bad position. I think is better to kind of uplift people from the bottom rather than lowering the standard.
So, Daniel, so is it a matter of how one or a society also defines success?
Sure. I mean, one way to think about this is, does success involve beating people, or does success involve joining people? And let me give a concrete example. You can actually go online and see side by side the winning women's vault, the gold medal women's vault in the 1952 and the 2006 Olympics or something like this. And what you see is that the woman who won in 2006, before she got to the pommel horse, had done more flips and spins than the winner did in her whole routine. And so the 2006 is much more meritocratic, it's much more competitive. But the question is, which is better for human flourishing? Gymnastics 100 years ago was a participatory activity that we could do together, that everyone could do, that the athletes and the observers were similarly situated in, and that was good for the health of people who participated in it. Competitive global gymnastics today has become so exclusive that we're either watchers or participants. We can't share a life together.
Is that a bad thing?
Well, that's one of the most ridiculous things I've ever
Is he complaining about professional sports? I don't get it.
Sports are competitive.
Like, what is that a bad thing?
And for the participants, it's a form of abuse. And we've seen this in the U.S. Women's Olympics abuse scandal.
It's a severe exaggeration. I think it's much better just to zoom out and just say, well, look, in human society, there's some people who are probably pushing themselves too hard. There's probably a lot more people who are barely pushing themselves at all, who have very little ambition, not trying to do much of anything with their lives. If we want to turn this into a discussion about self-help, I would say let's customize it to the individual. So we're talking about people that are going to Yale Law School. Yeah, to them I'd probably say, it's not really that great to make a pile of money as a lawyer. You should think about having a more balanced life. But if we're just giving advice to humanity in general, I'd say most people are lazy and lacking in motivation.
Okay.
You're making assumptions.
In the West, I would say.
There is a level of truth in saying people are lazy. Honestly speaking, some people are just not motivated to change their particular situations. But what I found problematic about Professor Caplan's arguments is that he then puts way too much emphasis on that point. He ignores the systems that exist, and I think he tries to simplify his argument way too much instead of looking at the greater context.
There are some people that I have met who seem to actually just love this intensely competitive activity that Dan is so opposed to. I mean, I think Dan is doing it, so I'm a little puzzled by that. But there are a lot of other people who seem to be very happy not trying very hard, and there's plenty of other people who are somewhere in the middle.
Look, one of the questions that every society has to ask itself is, how much inequality of outcome is it prepared to accept? And one of the lessons that we see now from social psychology and sociology in a transnational context is that when inequality in outcomes gets big enough, equality of opportunity becomes impossible, and inequality of outcomes actually suppresses the well-being of everybody all across the distribution. So it's a striking feature, for example, that the richest 1% in the United States are much, much richer than the richest 1% in Denmark, but they don't live as long, and they're not as happy. And that's partly connected to the inequality inside the United States. And so the answer is not absolute leveling, no ambition for anyone. I think probably one place we disagree on, also just empirically, my experience of people, and I went to 10 schools in 3 different countries, always the public school wherever I was, is that most people are actually pretty hardworking and take their lives pretty seriously and want to live well and do well. They do not want to climb to the top of the greasiest pole that they can find. But they are, in a human way, ambitious and want to live good lives.
I would just, stepping back, say that while it does sound very nice to say the only reason anybody fails is the structure of society is unjust, just a very unrealistic view of human psychology. There is just a huge range of human personalities. There are people who are very driven, there are people who are very lazy. Some of this changes with age. You can see that young kids are almost all lazy. So I actually do get to teach at a school that is not so elite, George Mason University, and I will say that a large share of the students are too lazy even to show up, do very basic work.
Lazy to even show up. Oh my God, okay.
And say, look, they can't. It's not that they can't, they just have better things to do with their lives in their own eyes.
Is he insulting his students? Why is he so judgy to our students? You know, he doesn't know their circumstances. There's so many structural issues, there's so many barriers that makes a person so disheartened that they stop trying.
So, I think it is much better to have a realistic view of what's actually going on instead of just saying something that's going to get people to feel good about it. It's like the world is just a lot harsher than people want to say. And yes, there's a lot of lazy and ambitious people in the world. It's a hard fact.
He's correct, Danny.
I think he can make his case.
He's not correct.
No, he can make his case in a more sympathetic fashion. I know what he's trying to say.
He's just talking about privileged, lazy people. That's
you don't have any drive, and if you're poor, it's your fault.
He seems to have no empathy. The way that he's passing comments about people's energy, and again, I just think his tone and everything is just very judgmental.
I kind of agree with the principle of the idea that some people have more ambition than others, but the remark was a bit crude.
If your value is always measured by what you achieve or produce, then what happens to people who are, for example, I won't use the term lazy, but I'll say what happens to people who are sick or aging or just simply quiet?
Why not use the word lazy? What's wrong with it? It's a good word.
I'll leave that word to you, but let's, Daniel, go ahead.
A couple of things. First of all, directly to your question, there are lots of ways to achieve something, and not all of them are valued by the market. And so, for example, we know, actually, there was a study produced by some economists in the UK a few years back, that lawyers and bankers get paid a wage that is greater than their social product. So if you ask how much does their labor contribute to just to GDP, lawyers and bankers get paid more than 100% of their contribution to GDP. Teachers, nurses, and rubbish collectors get paid 10% of their contribution to GDP.
Nurses.
Exactly.
Nurses.
Yeah. Exactly.
Doctors as well.
And friends and carers of the elderly and of children get paid 0% of their contribution to GDP. So there are lots of ways to value someone's contribution, which is not marketized, not competitive, not rankable. And we could have a life in a society in which we are more able to recognize those kinds of contribution.
The system of meritocracy that we exist within right now, it kind of has decided, based off of Western-centric, it's a very Western-centric idea of what success is, that you need to have money, you need to add economic value to the society, but somehow we don't look at social value as value. Like helping people out is not value somehow, being kind is not valuable somehow, being generous is not valuable.
So Poornima, do you think meritocracy has freed us from old injustices, or has it created a new class system with simply an illusion of fairness?
I think meritocracy is a myth, and it has created that inequity, inequality that we see in society. So I think the very concept of how we look at meritocracy today and the very construct of merit and how we define merit is deeply flawed. Now, if we try to define success more broadly, that people do achieve things in life through different talents, skills, experiences, life experiences, backgrounds, and if they're able to bring that together, that's not lowering the standards. That's expanding the pool of individuals that get into our workplaces.
When Dr. Luthra started to talk, I felt like a sense of relief because I was sitting there hearing things that I have gone through. She talked about intersectionality, gender, class, but like racism. And I think this was not being brought up a lot when we were talking about just merit. So it gave me a sense of relief, and I felt like heard when she was talking a lot. So in that moment when I felt more engaged in the conversation, I started really like trying to listen to the others because she kind of like reassured me that we were in a conversation where we are considering the realities of life.
Bryan, Poornima clearly says meritocracy is a myth. Do you agree?
I'm even puzzled as to what it would mean for it to be a myth. You don't think that if we just randomly assign people to jobs that it wouldn't be a disaster, do you? We just randomly picked who was doing surgery today. Wouldn't that be terrible?
That,
all right, well then it's
that's
not.
What I'm saying,
then it's not. A myth would mean something that's just totally wrong.
No one has ever said that.
No one's saying
no,
that.
She's saying oh my God.
She is saying that.
She literally did not say that.
So the myth is just hyperbole. It's something where you can get attention by saying, oh, it's a myth, but it's not a myth. It's not a myth that some people are over 6 feet tall. It's not a myth that some people are better at some things. And a system where you randomly assign people to jobs would be a disaster.
So if we look at the various studies that are CV studies, right, resume studies, and they're different ones done in different parts of the world, right? And they're replicated over and over again. So identical CVs, everything in the content of the CVs is the same, the name may vary. So it's done, for example, in Denmark with Mass versus Mohammed, all right, as the names. In the US, it's done with Black African-American sounding names versus more European sounding names. Now, if we were to solely base it on the competencies, if we believe that, yes, people are being hired solely on merit, then we shouldn't see the kind of results that we see out of these. You know, 50% more applications need to be sent in to get a single interview if you have a Black sounding, African-American sounding name. Or if your name happens to be Mohammed in Denmark, you have to send in 52%. If you're a woman wearing a hijab with a Muslim sounding name, you have to send in about 60% more applications. So if it's solely based on merit and none of these exist, right, these biases exist, then sure, in that ideal world, but they do.
Sometimes I think, is my name like a liability for me? So I felt like what he was saying resonated with me. Dr. Luthra, of course, is the only one among that panel who's a woman, right? So the rest of the panelists, they don't really have the same experiences or have not faced the same obstacle.
As to what's going on in these studies, I think a lot of it is probably that when people are going through applications, they are saving time by taking shortcuts. It does not mean that, on average, what they're doing is wrong. It's not something where it shows that someone is biased. Usual story. So if you are walking alone on a street and you see a guy who's heavily muscled and tattoos, you cross the street. You might say, well, if you knew his criminal record, it might turn out he's a very nice guy. And it's like, yeah, but I don't have the time and I don't want to risk my life in order to go and find out.
Well, the guy's
just admitting that he's incredibly prejudiced and biased.
It's facts. It's facts.
You can't live in this world and not think that there is a material amount of discrimination based on identity categories. All my life I have been overestimated, and that's connected to my identity. But I also agree with you, actually, Bryan, that meritocracy has, in addition, been a significant force for inclusion of previously excluded groups. So let me give you a very concrete example. In my law school, a couple of years back, had the highest share of people of color in its student body it had ever had, roughly 50%. It also had the highest average GPA and the highest average LSAT scores it ever had. And the reason why Yale Law School today is diversified on the basis of gender and race and ethnicity and religion is meritocracy. Because the old white male Protestant elite simply could not compete with the global population when people were measured based on their accomplishments. But at the same time, in the United States today, if one of your parents has a graduate or professional degree, your odds of hitting the Ivy League median on the SAT are 150 times greater than if neither of your parents graduated high school. And so it's also the case that meritocracy produces enormous amounts of inequality and exclusion. And,
well, of course, it's also
very
perfectly consistent with genetics playing an enormous role.
There is no evidence at all that the correlation between parents and children's IQs has increased over the past 4 or 5 generations, even as there is substantial evidence that the correlation between parents and children's education and incomes has increased. I don't believe the genetic explanation is credible.
So I do have a whole book on human genetics. You know, the hard fact is that the reason why children resemble their parents in test scores is overwhelmingly due to genetics. And we can see from kids that get adopted by high IQ families, when they are kids, they are slightly higher on standardized tests. By adulthood, they are not. All of the training that you're talking about, when you apply it to someone that doesn't have those same genetic advantages, it's very hard to see much payoff.
Please don't tell me he's saying what I think he's saying. Please, God. Obviously, he basically just kind of had this very strange answer where he was just like, well, you know, some truths are kind of hard to say, even if we don't like to say it, sometimes we have to. And I'm not really sure what he was alluding to there, but I'm not really sure I want to think about that hard.
Are we in the animal kingdom? Like, are we playing the survival of the fittest to just like abandon those people who don't like kind of fit?
So this is, go ahead. Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, go
just,
ahead,
just
and
one
then,
thing
and then Parag.
this is, look, there are lots of wonderful things about this debate format. A difficult one is when people have factual disagreements. We are not well placed in this group to resolve factual disagreements. So without trying to win a factual, let me just register that my read of the data is different from yours. I know you've got a book, and I don't think your view is totally unreasonable, but reasonable people can disagree about those facts. And so I just want to register that, and we should move on, because we can't resolve it here. We'd have to go look at the facts.
I mean, it was basically a eugenicist argument. I mean, at the end of the day, if you think that genetics is a huge determinant in how, you know, jobs and the economy works, that first means you think poor people are genetically inferior, and secondly means that if you actually want an efficient society, we should do eugenics. And, you know, I think any sort of philosophy that leads you to those two conclusions is just inherently wrong.
I felt mad because, like, it's just nobody should be allowed to just say that and get away with it. I think that he should be exposed.
To hear that from a Western professor was insane. So I guess West is not the kind of pinnacles of progress, I guess.
Is the very concept and idea of meritocracy a Western import, a Western idea?
That's an interesting one. So I think, you know, when we look at the very idea of how we define merit in itself, and, you know, we've had the discussion today around success as well, I do think a lot of it comes from a more global north, you know, capitalist model of how we define success. And you could argue that, you know, even countries in the global south look to the global north, you know, in aspiration of some of that. So that does exist, and there's a desire to define merit in a way that is grounded in a capitalist model and in a global north model. Yes, but at the same time, I think if we look at, you know, I'm someone who looks at ancient philosophy and draws inspiration from some of that, you know, concepts like the ikigai principle in Japan, about what does it mean to actually feel that deep sense of success. You need to be doing things that you love, what the world needs, something you can be paid for, and something that you're good at. And, you know, I have been challenged myself, moving to Denmark. All the things that I held as important to me that supposedly defined success, when I moved there, really were challenged. Because it wasn't. People didn't look at those things in the same way. They didn't give as much weight to those things. And then when you start looking around and you start speaking to people, not everyone desires to be in that small few places that are right at the top. And I think just being not judged on the basis of that, I think it's beautiful. It's refreshing that, you know, society around you doesn't see you as a failure because you are not reaching for the next position above, but you're actually very happy to go down a position, and they in fact celebrate it.
I really liked Poornima's points, but her, like, she kept bringing back the example of Denmark. I just don't agree with the fact that we need to keep using that. I think there are other examples. I think, again, we kind of still end up revolving around Western-centric ideals of what a society should look like if it wants to better itself.
I mean, it's really worth pointing out that what you're talking about of people saying, I don't want to go and strive for more, I want to go and do an easier job, it's a luxury that you have when you're comfortable. This is something that relatively capitalist countries offer. If you're on the edge of starvation saying, I guess I'll just just go down only working half the day is not really an option. And by the way, just to say something favorable and true about my hosts, so Qatar, Emirates, I consider them much better countries than Denmark, actually. Why? Because they are 88% foreign-born. They let in the talent of the world, and not just petroleum engineers. They let in people who come and drive cars. They let in people to go and clean rooms. These are people who are able to make 5 or 10 times as much money as they do in their home countries. And because it is a system based on work rather than saying we're going to take care of people, they allow people to go and actually get a much better life for themselves.
Yeah, so Professor Caplan, I think he has a gross misunderstanding of the population structure of Qatar, as well as the immigration structure of Qatar and the immigration policy, as a fact, right? So the reality is in Qatar, alhamdulillah, we are at an advantageous situation where we can actually find the best people and bring them to work here, rather than it being the case that he believes, when people can come and look for jobs here. So over here, we are around 10% of the population, and the reason why we have a 90% that is immigrants isn't because they are a necessity within our economy, right? And we need them, and we actually, by intention, go and find the best people.
I agree with you entirely about immigration.
All right.
And, one of the great unfairnesses globally is the birthright lottery. The thing that I really want to focus on is this thought that much of what we've been talking about is beside the point for most of humanity right now, which is, as you say, young, urban, living in a developing country. And there, I think the real question is the best hope for those people in those societies an expansion of market competition or some other developmental program?
There isn't, a single paradigm to answer that question. You have, the petro-monarchies of the Gulf states that have, again, imbued with certain natural resources that they've been able to extract, exploit, harness, and to, again, lead to this incredible development, economic development, social development that they have achieved. Other countries don't have those resources. Then, the withdrawal of what you're calling multinational extraction practices is not actually going away. It may be replaced by other things. And then you have to factor in automation. If we want to really focus on that, that ordinary young person today who's facing either living in a society where you don't have any foreign investment, which is not a great situation to be in. You may be in a corrupt, underdeveloped country. And then you may have AI and automation coming in from the other side, where it's going to warp what our very notions of merit in the first place. Again, a matter for another debate also. But let's put ourselves in the shoes of that ordinary person where at a minimum, and if we reduce it to economic terms, we might say, okay, the average person, again, behind this veil of ignorance needs to find their way in the non-tradable services economy, right? In other words, day-to-day work that human beings do for each other that isn't necessarily outsourceable or automatable. And that's going to be things like construction or teaching or driving or delivery services or elderly care, whatever the case may be. How is that person going to thrive in that environment? That is, again, like when we're talking about the rank and file of young humanity today, that's the dilemma they face. It's not, am I going to get into Yale Law School, right?
Can I just ask one question just on this point? So I think to connect this to our debate about meritocracy, there isn't going to be one solution, but will it be a running theme through the solutions as they differ in different places, that we want to construct those tasks, driving, caregiving, teaching, in a competitive way in which we rank people about whether they do them better or worse, so in a loosely meritocratic way? Or will it be a running theme across settings that we want to construct those in an inclusive and non-competitive way?
And I think it's going to be, fortunately, the latter in a lot of these countries, and I live in Asia, where you have vast income inequality. So the link may be the meritocracy and inequality link versus not. In Asia, what I find is that despite the vast economic inequality that exists, right, people aren't focused on inequality itself the way it is such a lightning rod issue in the United States. Instead, they're focused on poverty reduction, right, because they see that you want to raise the floor, not necessarily lower the ceiling. So long as people receive a certain decent wage for that work, they're going to be content despite the fact that there are billionaires in their midst. And I think that's actually a healthy attitude towards the fact that you cannot simply eradicate economic inequality, you cannot eliminate meritocracy, nor should you, right? But you can focus on raising that floor.
I agree with you, Parag, that if meritocracy is what
it should be in an ideal sense. I think, sure, there's a lot of merit to having meritocracy exist, but I don't think it exists in that way. And so until we make the efforts to actually create real meritocracy in its true essence, that people are indeed assessed based on their skills, competencies, performance, but that requires effort. And I don't believe that we're making enough effort, because the people who are holding the positions at the very top, the decision makers, believe that it is meritocratic, that they've got there because of their merit, not because of any unearned or earned privileges or advantages that they have.
The German poet Bertolt Brecht once said that I want no worker under me and no boss man over my head. And he was not an unambitious man. His conception of ambition was to step outside of hierarchy. And one of the live questions for us in the rich nations of the world, but also in the developing nations of the world, is to what degree is stepping outside of hierarchy and creating a world in which there are many avenues to flourishing, and flourishing is available not just to exceptional people, but to ordinary people, precisely because they're not ranked. To what degree is this a better path to success for everyone? And to what degree is this a pipe dream and a fantasy, and we need hierarchy to generate growth to make life bearable for anyone? And those are obviously two extreme positions, and the truth is somewhere in between them. But the question is, where on this continuum do we think that we are collectively? And my guess is that I am more towards the side of the continuum that thinks that hierarchy is at this stage damaging human flourishing than that it is promoting human flourishing. Bryan, I think you're more on the side of thinking hierarchy is promoting human flourishing and a false drive for equality is damaging it.
I'm also on the side of saying that an individual unilaterally, without changing their society, can choose a different path in life, and it's actually pretty easy. Whenever someone says, I'm forced to go and do this, once in a while that's true, like you're chained against a wall. However, for the vast majority of people in rich countries and even in middle and many poor countries, there's actually a wide menu. So, you know, like in your book, you talk a lot about people that are doing these law firm jobs. There are also in-house counsel jobs. There are part-time jobs. My wife started off doing a job like the one that you're talking about, and then she switched to other ones, and she did not explode. It would not ruin her life. It gave her a better life.
If the society has those options to begin with, and I think it's important to note
which one doesn't? Which one doesn't have a range?
When we look at developing countries today, I think they're actually rightly trying to pursue a bit of all of the above. A developing country today, again, pick one, from any one of the 100 out there, would like to have a couple of elite universities or campuses of Western elite universities on their soil. They also want to have a lot more trade schools and vocational institutions, and they're learning from everyone from Korea to Germany to France and how to do those institutions as well. So, and then of course they want to have entrepreneurship, right? People who just, you know, circumvent formal channels and become, you know, sort of successful in their own right. All of the above is happening in most of the world right now, but it's not simply a market accident, right? It's also a matter of governance and saying these are the things that we need to do because we have large, poor populations, not all of whom are going to be able to qualify for elite academic institutions, nor do we even need to overproduce, you know, surplus elites, as we also know is being a problem in Western society. So they're actually watching what they want to see and what aspects of Western societies are role models for them and also which ones are not role models for them.
I think we do need to come down to how do we define this? How do we look at it? And this abundance and flourishing of opportunities. I'll give you my own example, right? I have a squiggly career, how I define it as a squiggly career. When I was 17, 18 years old, there were only 3 options that were available to me. It was to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. I always wanted to study human behavior. But the viewpoint around me, the conditioning around me was that this wasn't a lucrative pathway forward. What would you do? How would success look like for you? But if you went down the pathway of being a doctor, lawyer, or engineer, it was very clear.
Guaranteed success.
It was guaranteed success. Whatever that success looked like, that success was not defined by me at the age of 17. It was very much defined by my family, by society, and that was what I did. So I, stereotypically happened to be good at math and science, so I went down engineering. Didn't want to be a doctor, didn't want to be a lawyer, so engineering it was. But I was deeply unhappy. It wasn't what I wanted to do, and I found my squiggly way back to what I wanted to finally get into studying human behavior and pursuing a PhD in the area that I wanted to. But this is the thing that, when we talk about options being available. Actually, they're not.
Look, the fact that an option isn't encouraged doesn't mean it's not an option. There's all sorts of non-encouraged options, heavily discouraged options. Some people take them. I mean, so much of the feeling that I got reading Dan's book was actually just, you've got to be much more of a nonconformist. If you sit around worrying about what other people think, then of course you're going to feel, oh, I'm so oppressed, I don't have any agency. And look, the main lesson of the modern world is actually the range of what you can get away with is enormous. And it's just a question of, do you have the courage to actually try things that other people don't approve of?
I'm sorry, when you think about the number of people who have to, who come from discriminated, marginalized backgrounds, even if you put in all of that effort, even if you strive, you've got courage, you have systems, culture that's constantly working against you. And you are battling that every step of the way. I mean, I've had to go through 2 extra rounds of job interviews on the interview panel just to get my associate professorship. I've been questioned being the first person of color in my department in CBS. They've never hired a person of color before. And there have been questions about my merit. There have been questions about my ability to perform when the data shows otherwise.
If I could say one more thing, Bryan, to your thought about whether it takes creativity and nonconformity to find options. One of the problems that the rich countries of the world have and the rich economies of the world have is that for a variety of reasons which are related to technological change, but also fundamentally, in my view, to meritocracy, their labor markets have become enormously polarized. And so in the United States, for example, roughly 1/3 of the middle-class jobs in the economy have disappeared over the past 3 decades. If you want to talk about this in a concrete narrative way, in 1950, the biggest employer in the United States was General Motors. This was lifetime employment at middle-class wages. 2000, the biggest employer in the United States was Walmart. This is not lifetime employment at wages so low that Walmart stores have Thanksgiving charity collections for food so that their own employees can afford Thanksgiving dinners. So what's happened is that the middle of the labor market has just disappeared. And there are far fewer reasonably available options for people who want neither to be a rat in the rat race nor part of the precariat. And if the middle disappears, then most people will not be able to find the kind of safe, secure life in which they pursue other kinds of flourishing.
But I mean, he's right though. I mean, if you go to a Walmart in America, you actually notice that a lot of people working there are not who you think should be working there, who are teenagers trying to get job experience. But it's actually a lot older people.
Agreed. I'm not saying that this. I'm not saying the U.S. is perfect meritocracy. I'm not saying that they do a good job at helping the poor. But what I am saying is he's trying to blame this on meritocracy.
Okay, Daniel, let me ask you this. Can any system ever truly be fair?
So my own personal view, which is outside of this debate, is in a certain sense no, because I'm somebody who believes that the way in which our moral values work is that there can be no social world without loss, and that we end up sacrificing some values to pursue others. And we can't fit everything together perfectly to achieve all our values at once. We have to make tragic choices. But that's another longer conversation. I think in the sense you're asking the question, the forces that push away from whatever conception of fairness we're going to embrace are very powerful. And the art of politics is to marshal our collective resources in a steady, steely struggle to get as close to fairness as we can. As Max Weber said, politics is a long and slow boring of hard boards. It requires both passion and perspective. And the art of politics is to keep our eye on the ball and to try to get as fair as we can.
Poornima, can any system ever truly be fair?
Nope, because human beings are biased, and there will always be bias that's embedded into the ways in which we do things, but I don't believe that that should be an excuse. I do believe that we do need to make an effort to try to block the influence of bias in our system structures and the decisions that we make and our interactions with people, so that we are aspiring towards hopefully what is fairer for larger groups of people. But is it going to be completely fair? No, not as long as human beings the way we are and the way our brains function, no.
Bryan, do you agree?
No, can is a strong word, so the answer has to be yes. Like, if everyone figured out what the right thing to do was and did it.
Systems can be fair.
Yes, if everyone figured out the right thing to do and did it, then the system would be perfectly fair. Highly unlikely to happen in the real world, but it is doable.
Parag.
I would like to see systems balance meritocracy and a utilitarianism or utilitarian ethos much more productively and holistically than they presently do. So again, sort of ambition on the inputs, but utilitarianism on the outputs. And I don't think that currently that's how most countries are structured, but I think that we can get there. I also think we have huge opportunities for empowerment right now. We've focused a lot in this conversation on education, but we've obviously already entered a world in which education is abundantly available. The best classroom in the world might just be the internet. And that obviously changes the way we view the narrowness of opportunity in the first place.
Well, this is an excellent moment to check in with our students, because throughout this debate, our panel of students and recent graduates have all been listening to what you have to say. They've carefully listened to your ideas as well as your arguments. So next, I'll join them as they reflect and deliberate on what they just heard. And after their discussion, they'll return to share their own perspectives along with questions and challenges.
So I think a lot of people are having quite a lot of pushback with this idea of merit. Merit exists in the world. This is why we celebrate people who are successful. You find people celebrating stars like Ronaldo, Messi, or Elon Musk. And we get to see that we arrive at such a place because we see merit as something which is showing competence, that someone is able to achieve and to do something specific. And so to say merit and the system of meritocracy doesn't exist, I find it quite flawed, because then what are you saying exists in the world if it is not that?
I think I had something that I agreed on with everyone except Bryan. His perception that people are somehow genetically, naturally, generally, some people are better than others on those bases is just completely wrong. I think his ideas of the fact that some sort of objective merit exists and some people just don't measure up to that is completely wrong.
At the end of the debate, they both sort of agreed that merit is a good ideal to strive towards, and that hierarchy is inevitable. And that we should help promote good behavior amongst people who otherwise aren't successful.
I think that Professor Markovits, his perspective is actually better on a, a legislative point of view, right? So in terms of trying to ensure that the structural inequalities are addressed on a structural level, a population level, yeah, of course you need to take this point of view of understanding that there are inequalities and addressing them. However, for me as a person, for any random person, how would I advise them? I'd advise them to take the point of view of Caplan. Yes, how I behave, how I affect myself, the effort I put in is going to be the results that I get, right? So I think this is the best perspective to have for success.
So you've all heard from our panel of speakers. Is meritocracy a just principle, or is it simply an illusion? We've heard 4 very different takes from our guests. Sundus, what stood out for you?
What stood out for me was Bryan Caplan's view that somehow genetics and nature can decide what merits you have and decide who's more hardworking and who's not, and who is more likely to be successful and not. Because it's a eugenist view and it's very biased, and it has inherent roots in colonial ideology.
Felicia, do you share that view?
Yes, I agree with Sundus very much. I thought that this was a way to devalue people. I think it kind of takes away from the effort that a lot of people can put in. And I just think it's a way to feel very entitled about other people's work.
Hamad, what about you?
So actually, I disagree with both of them. I think that the reality of life in general is that many of the factors of your personality, whether it be your intelligence or even your height or your weight or your physical superiority, are going to be determined by genetics, right? So I don't think you have to draw a line in the sand and say everything physical can be determined by genetics. However, I think in general, the children of intelligent parents are going to more likely be more intelligent, whether it be by nature or nurture.
I think once we start factoring in and adding things like genetics, we start adding another layer in terms of discrimination.
I mean, the way that Professor Caplan kind of structured his argument actually kind of proves one of the huge issues with sort of the narrative of meritocracy. I think we all agree or most of us agree that meritocracy is an ideal, right? We should aspire towards meritocracy. But, I think one of the issues is sort of the narrative, and, the one that was pushed by Caplan is essentially, if you haven't made it as far as I have, or if you haven't made it very far, there's something wrong with you. You're lazy, you don't have the right genetics, and this is a really slippery slope, because the reality is that, society is far more complex than that. There are historical injustices that have occurred, there are ongoing inequalities. So when you reach the conclusion that people are simply at the bottom because they're actually the least qualified people, you then reach the conclusion that, well, sub-Saharan Africa must actually be filled with the stupidest people because it's the poorest region in the world. Instead of actually blaming individual people for, processes that are way out of their control, how can we structurally change things so that there is actually more access to these sorts of opportunities?
I think the really dangerous thing is when we start thinking of genetics as also a determinant of intelligence. That's when it gets really dangerous, right? Ultimately, it's really a nature versus nurture debate. And I believe very strongly that if you put two people in the same situation, 99% of the time, they will end up as the same person.
John Carlos?
This debate would have benefited if there was the perspective of, does meritocracy create virtuous people, virtuous and principled individuals? And in my opinion, not necessarily. Because if you just have merit without virtue, then you have people who are basically tyrannical, right? And a good example of this, to which meritocrats and aristocrats would often point to, is Winston Churchill. I mean, he was a skilled military commander. I mean, sure, he lost some battles in World War I, but he graduated from Oxford. He was elected by the common people. And in certain ways, he is meritocratic, but he is by far not a virtuous person. I mean, he's completely racist, for one. He has ignored the plight of Indian peoples in colonial India and the British Raj. So I think that when it comes to virtue, I think we should also incorporate it within these discussions, because just because you have merit doesn't mean you're a virtuous person.
I think some can make the argument that virtue should be considered a merit if you have a track record of doing good things. For example, within the majority of universities, any part of your merit is going to be the virtue that you have displayed in your past. For example, the actual charity work that you do, all of these different things are considered. And I think they are actually, within our current system, considered as merit for applications to not only jobs, but also universities or any other thing that you want to get into.
But this kind of logic only cheapens virtue by making it as a merit, right? There are just some things out there that cannot be merited, such as virtue. If we continuously do volunteering activities just for merit, right, and not because it is a virtue in and of itself, then what are we doing to virtue?
But there's no other system that can quantify your virtue and value your virtue in order to put people who are virtuous further ahead, right?
But it is a system that cannot work. I personally believe if you want to understand the world, you have to look at how it treats the most vulnerable people. And those, for a fact, right now we're living in the largest displacement crisis in the world. 120 million people across the world displaced. How do you expect that whole part of the world to survive in a system like this? And do they have a level playing field? They do not have access to education. They do not have safety, which is number one. If you want to go to school, you need to be safe. You need to have a home.
There is meritocracy on national level, and there is meritocracy on a whole global level, right? Try to compete within your national level first and try to achieve and try to go up the ladder within your national level for you to be able to go into other areas, right? It's something that is completely normal for you. Even over here, you can study medicine, and once you go to the US, you have to study some other years again for the sake of meritocracy. This is a choice that you are trying to make because you're trying to go up the ladder. And this is something that's completely normal because some countries are much more sophisticated in their infrastructure compared to other countries.
But that's not necessarily true, because I mean, we see in the Gulf region particularly, we know that there's a passport hierarchy, right? You're respected based off of the different passports you have. Medicine is actually a great example. The fact that completing USMLE is considered the ultimate the oracle of medical education is ridiculous, right? Because there are these people who work incredibly hard to be good at the medical field that they do, and they come to the United States and they go, no, actually we think your medical education system is stupid. You're going to start all over, and then you have to do twice the work for half the result. But I think the problem is when we talk about people, when we hire people, assuming that meritocracy is real and assuming that meritocracy is applied, then we're basically measuring people unfairly.
I think the problem is when you try to change things via top-down DEI policies, for example, you're not going to fix the actual structural issue. What people are doing today, for example, UCLA Medical School was recently sued because the dean of admissions over there literally said she's going to lower the standard for African American
And let me
students.
add on to this, like from the perspective of like medical administration. I'm a medical student, and like I know many different cases and like the reason why they do these things, right? So for example, within the United States, the reason why they need to actually have like certain qualifications in order to work there is because they have a completely different system, right? The system that's going to be applied within the United States is going to be different from Sudan and different from other countries with different resources.
But even in the Gulf, they respect U.S. medical licenses more than their own domestic medical licenses, which is kind of embarrassing.
That's because of how hard it is to get to the U.S. And I understand what you mean in terms of like how meritocracy can be deeply flawed because of the difference in equality of opportunities, etc. However, what we need to consider is that there is no system better than meritocracy to give the people who are exceptional from lower class opportunities the ability for upwards mobility. Me as a medical student, I know many different cases of people from, for example, Syria, from example, like other different, like even refugees who did their USMLEs, who studied as hard as they can, who got the highest scores and were able to go and do residency even in places like the United States, right? The reality is there's no other system. What are we going to do? Go back to tribal-based systems? Like meritocracy is the best possible way to give those people upwards mobility and not trap them in poverty as a whole.
I think we all agree that the system ideally would be amazing. I put in effort and I get rewarded for it. What we're talking about is whether the merits and the standards on which we are assessed and the way that we're analyzed and who is analyzing us and assessing us, is all of it not biased? It is biased. We're just saying we need to push it, we need to expand it, we need to look at different things when we're considering what is of value and what is not of value. Doctors bring a lot of value to the society, but so do teachers. You couldn't drive to like if your driver didn't drive you to your med school, you wouldn't be able to be a doctor. If your mom didn't take care of you at home, you wouldn't be able to be a doctor. You wouldn't be alive here. So just about like the concept of value and how we look at success, we need to push against that. It's a very Western-centric idea. And yes, in America, I understand if you're going to America and you're going to be a doctor there, it makes sense that you're well-versed with the American culture or their system. But then why is it that those people, when they come here, they're prioritized over those who have like gained their education in the Gulf? Coming from a recovering country due to British colonization, I think what the British people did to the Indo-Pak subcontinent had a lot to do with this Western-centric like idea of some people being better than others on the basis of race, on the basis of caste, on the basis of you appearing a certain way, them coming in here and introducing their concept of education, them coming in here and telling people that they're going to civilize them, has really left legacies within the country that still affect the systems that we live in. Like the more you can impersonate the colonizers, the more you're valued in these countries, even though they're so-called decolonized countries. So I think these recovering countries need to move away from such ideologies. Coming from one, it's a very important topic to me.
But isn't the goal of meritocracy?
Like also, I wanted to go back to...
You were agreeing with what Sundus had to say?
Yes, but I wanted to go back to Hama's point about these people who were like very poor in Syria, Yemen, whatever, had very bad situations, and they still made it, right, because of their effort. I feel like this is very high exceptions. If you look at the majority of numbers of people who try very hard in very bad places, they never make it out of the country. If you go back to me, for example, I come back from a very poor town. We don't have a lot of things, and I was in a public school for most of my life, and I got here because like I worked very hard. But how many people do you think in El Salvador worked that hard as much as me and didn't make it here? And I was the only one who got that scholarship. It's possible for like meritocracy to give you a chance, but you're only using exceptions. You are not looking at the majority, and that's why I think it's not working. I'm actually like from a town in El Salvador called Berlín Usulután, and we're in the mountains, and we have only public schools. There's no universities, and I actually was in a public school up until maybe a beginning of high school. And so whenever we're talking here, I noticed that we kind of talk about it from the middle class or upper. And I think it's because the speakers and even my own peers kind of forget that, think that we are more privileged already because we're here. And I understand, we are more privileged, but that makes us forget where we come from. So whenever I was having these conversations, the speakers or my peers thought, okay, but she's the same as us. So she's working just as much. So there was a moment in time where I felt very emotional because I wanted to express that I actually feel like I work way harder, and people don't understand, undermine how hard somebody has to work for things. And that's why I think was missing. They were saying, work hard, but how hard?
I think the problem that we're facing with your argument is we are assuming that you have to be given something, especially if you're coming from a disadvantaged background, or that if we give everyone at least an equal footing, then the outcomes are going to improve. That is not necessarily the case. What I would say is, because people start with that unfair advantage, it equalizes out to actually create a fair advantage, because it's also assuming that if you're going to start at the very top, then your likelihood of success is going to be guaranteed, which is not necessarily the case. You might have the resources, go to the school, have the tutors, have the money, but still end up not successful. What I would say, especially in response to what you are saying about refugees, is of course you might be in a situation in which you are disadvantaged, but it's not like if you're going to fail, there's one dead-end street. Like failure is one dead-end street in which the whole cycle begins to close. You can still push forward and you can still improve your life. What Merit is basically trying to say is, if you are hungry enough to change your situation, you will achieve that. I believe in individual agency because I believe the world owes you nothing. If you want to succeed in this particular world, you need to work for it. I came from a system while I was still in high school in Zimbabwe in which there were no resources. There was nothing, right? And the only way that at least I was able to escape from that situation, and some of my peers, was through hard work and individual agency.
You want people on survival mode to go out there and survive even more, to earn the merit, the so-called merit that we don't know what's the standard, what's the criteria for that merit.
But
yes, people are suffering already, do you understand? We need equity. We need equity to level the playing field.
Who determines equity?
How do you define equity?
I'll differentiate between equality and equity because it's very important for this debate. Equality is basically the idea that we all have access to certain rights and inherent value. Right? It does not. Equity is the idea that someone should determine, based on historical injustice and inequalities, that we have to uplift someone else and take away from someone else because it's a net zero system. That is an inherently unfair system. And the reason why is because rather than giving people the inherent value and dignity that every single person has, treating them based on what they do, not based on their identity or their intrinsic characteristic, what they instead say is, let's treat people based on their skin color and their race, but in the opposite direction. You only further embolden injustice. You only entrench injustice with that system. I hold merit near and dear to my heart in the sense that I believe that I should be judged based on what I do. I don't believe it's fair to judge me based on things that are outside my control. Like, I did not choose to be born in a two-parent household, for example. My parents were, luckily enough for me, involved in my education in my life. And I know others were not. Some people had parents who were not involved, or some people had absent fathers or absent mothers. But I don't think it's fair to have someone determine whether or not I should succeed or not based on my race or identity, even if I was privileged.
You don't have to take away from people in the top to give people from the bottom. You don't have to punish people above. I don't know why you even think that. What we're trying to say
there is a finite amount of seats at the end of the day.
We're fixing social injustices, systematic injustices that actually hurt more people in the bottom.
Hold on.
Once we bring these people above, we're taking away from the white people above, you know? We're putting them in the same standard. So now they are not limited by those biases that are already there from history.
I have a question for you, Felicia, then. All right, so you say that I'm mischaracterizing it because taking away from others and that. So in certain companies, in certain C-suites, they have to have X% of people be women or African Americans. Isn't that taken away from others who otherwise would be white and qualified, but give it to those who are African American and white women?
Okay, why do you think we have that quota?
No, but again, first and foremost, is actually a more deeper question. What is the metric? We hear a lot about metrics in meritocracy, how metrics are subjective. But in reality, if the state determines the metrics, what is the limiting principle? If the state can determine what is good and what is bad based on these principles, isn't that just further emboldening tyranny?
Well,
and
you're forgetting why we have the quota. We have the quota because there's no equity to start from. If we were all starting at the principle, at the same line, then you will not need a quota.
I want to answer. Let's hear from Tayama before the question.
The room was like, how does it had an energy. I mean, people were so loud that I had trouble kind of listening.
I feel like everyone is making this kind of hasty generalization that people can actually, like most people can succeed in a meritocratic system, which like my peers have said, it's not true. In equal society, when you equalize, it feels like oppression for the privileged group. While we're actually equalizing, like it's like this. Some people are here, some people are here. When you're doing this, the people on top feel like they're being lowered, but it's not actually the case. We're basically giving equity, right?
Okay.
We're making the starting line the same. Okay, for example, my country has the quota system, right? Which I feel like Wright knows a lot about, which I don't agree with whatever he's saying. But like we have in our constitution, it says that 1/3 of the parliament members should be women. And you know what is actually having is like changing policy for the better. For example, we had system, like in Nepal, called the Chaupadi system, where menstruating women were barred from the house. They had to stay in the cowshed. And because of female MPs in the parliament after the constitution was there, and in the local level, they actually worked together to kind of ban the system altogether. And similarly, after the quota system was established, other kind of policies, such as like like domestic violence policy and gender discrimination policy was also passed. And other than gender, I feel like if you just have people, privileged people in the top, they don't see the reality. So we need representation from marginalized people to actually have a better system.
I have to push back on what you're saying in terms of having DEI, because at least my major problem with DEI is how it's been used, especially in the current day, is we're having incompetent people being put in these incompetent spaces. I think the most logical argument is if we level the playing field, especially in terms of requirements, then we then look at all of the other different metrics and factors.
The problem with the anti-DEI crowd is really they keep talking about this incompetence that's everywhere. You know, people getting hired just because they're black or just because they're women. But there's actually like barely any examples anywhere of like something failing because an incompetent person was hired purely because they're black. It's absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, like I do have to add, you know, the whole point of DEI isn't just, oh, this person is black, this person is a woman, I'm gonna hire them. It's also, oh, let me make sure that this job advertisement reaches all communities and not just the same community, right? Let's get this perspective in. Because for example, like, I mean, in academia, we already complained about how academia is such an echo chamber. I mean, imagine how much worse it would be if, you know, we just totally ignored, you know, any kind of idea of diversity.
I've seen the way that I'm privileged in my life, right? Both the ways I've not been privileged and the ways that I have been privileged. So I mean, as a dual Iraqi American citizen, I can see the way that my life is fundamentally different from that of my relatives back home because I have an American passport, because I have an American high school diploma, especially, because I'm about to get an American university education. And so I feel really strongly that, you know, instead of blaming individual people for their decisions, we can actually look what are some of the structural problems that create these inequalities.
I want to ask a question to the entire crowd here, because I think it's important to differentiate between equity and equality. Carl's proposition is more so related to equality, because he's saying that we have to give people, especially in poor neighborhoods, maybe disproportionately African American or Latino in the United States, the ability to go to school and have a safe community and be able to have a good family, right? That is equality, and that's not taking away from anyone else. But equity, the program that DEI supports, is the inverse of it, and I'll explain why. It's because rather than solving these problems, they would rather have a cosmetic fix. So instead of having, for example, schools being fixed in Baltimore, they'd rather have Harvard lower the standard of SATs.
You can do both.
No, you can't do both, because you're lowering the standard, and by then that's why we have higher dropout rates amongst African Americans in Harvard and these different schools. That's why even when they graduate, the people don't really treat them the same way, because there's this mentality of DEI that people therefore inherently distrust them.
Nobody's rejecting someone's application. It's not like you see a black person who graduated from Harvard and you're just like, oh, you didn't deserve the degree, you're black. You were clearly only admitted because you're black.
Hang on a second, let's hear from Sundus.
I think
go ahead.
I have a couple of points. Like
Sure.
when you're talking about lowering of the standards, I find that there needs to be some reflection on your part when we're talking about adjustment of the standards, adjustment of the criteria. It doesn't necessarily mean they're lowering it. So that just means you think there's a certain merit that's objective, and I don't know where it's coming from, falling from the sky, and then if we're adjusting it, somehow we're lowering it.
But all right, I'll ask you, I'm
not finished, guys.
Let's hear what she has to say.
Then I want to talk about tests. Like, there is no objective metric that can decide one person is better than the other. If there is anything,
the test score. Yeah, actually.
The SAT is nowhere near an objective measurement.
You think the SAT can actually determine that certain people are smarter than the other? Don't you think that it's not sensitive to those people who are neurodivergent? Don't you think it's not sensitive to people who haven't had the same training?
It also only
don't you think that you just have to learn and think
we're not talking about the
ACT,
we're talking about, like, let's say, for example, medical school.
I want to ask Sundus a question. So I want to make it simple. So you can look at the common data set for Georgetown. I believe the median SAT score is around 1,500. Do you believe that it's a good and just policy to lower the standard of the SATs to around 1,200 for African Americans and for Latinos? Do you think that's a fair and just policy? Do you think it's actually going to fix inequities in society?
I think yes, and I'm going to explain. Earlier, you said earlier that children of parents who come from educated families, and they come from educated families, will obviously be more likely to have better training and be better equipped to get into these universities. So a child of a parent who historically has not received education or are not educated will obviously not have the same upbringing, will obviously not have the same training. To try to bring them into these spaces, to try to give them the opportunity to then give that forward to their next generations, what is wrong about that?
I actually graduated from a community school. It's technically a private school, but it's a community school. It has nowhere near the budget of those very big private schools that have American and IB curriculums, for example. When I got my SAT, I think it was poor, even for Georgetown standards, right? It just so happened that COVID came around and SATs were completely just banned, but I got in and I graduated magna cum laude. So the fact that SATs are just like a perfect determiner of what that is does not completely take into account the holistic being that you are, right? And of course, you know, we like to delude ourselves, but Harvard and Georgetown admissions, they're holistic admissions. But the truth is, even if you have like an SAT score combined with your family privileges, you get more extracurricular activities, you get these faux volunteer opportunities in a country like Latin America, in countries like Latin America, for example. You would be significantly disadvantaged, even though you have the character yourself to work as hard as any other student at Georgetown, at Harvard, at Princeton, at Yale.
I think another thing that you need to consider is emotional intelligence. When you're in hospitals, you need a lot of pressure, time management. It's very into your psychological state. Also, you need to look into skills. I have trembling hands. Even no matter how intelligent I am, I cannot be in medical school if I have shaking hands.
No, you can be a psychiatrist.
No, yeah, but I'm talking about, I could choose maybe something that I didn't want to be, but I'm just saying that intellectual is not everything. I could say like, oh, I want to do psychiatry, but like maybe that was not my dream. I do feel like there was like a disconnect or like a very like tense moment between the girls and the guys. And I don't know if it's a personal thing or maybe it's because I feel I connected with the girls more on the topic, but it did become very tense and I didn't kind of like, I enjoyed that there was a lot of going on, but at the same time it felt weird because I felt like we were not really trying to listen to the speakers, but mostly trying to prove a point between us. But I think it's also good to like also hear your other like peers.
I think our value can come from other things. I think there are plenty of people out there who go to college who don't have to go to college. They're very good at something else that doesn't really require 4 years in college and wasting thousands of dollars on a degree. They can go elsewhere and work at an apprenticeship or a trade school and actually provide value in other ways that we can actually see. But when it comes to those seats at Harvard and Georgetown, or at these elite colleges, and going back to my earlier point about hierarchies, you want to ensure that people at the top of that hierarchy are not there because of their last name. They're because of their competence. We have to find the best possible standards. Now, is SAT perfect? No. There can always be ways to tinker with it. But I think it's better than having a holistic approach. I think in many ways it kind of comes to why the degree's been so diluted.
So you guys, I mean, this is a great conversation, really kind of powerful exchange of ideas that you're sharing. So we have the professor that you were referring to, the other three guests. Are you guys ready to meet them? Are you excited to meet them?
Yeah.
Let's go meet them. Come on.
It was a very robust argument. I think it was a bit of a bloodbath. I think all of us were trying to get our 2 cents in, of course, and some of us were getting a couple more cents in than the other.
I really wanted to touch more about the psychological effects of meritocracy. I felt like if we were going a bit back and forth, I was not able to like really prove my point about despair because it got confused between despair of having things out of your hands versus having things because you feel guilty that you're not enough for the system. So it would have been very good for, I would have enjoyed talking more about it because I have suffered it and people around me have as well. So it's very important to the conversation.
So we've heard some really compelling arguments from our speakers, and our student panel has taken time to reflect, challenge, and wrestle with those ideas. Now, they've joined our experts here in the studio, ready with their insights off their own. Amir, you had a question for Bryan.
So my question, you tended to assign a lot of individual agency to people. And you know, one of the things we stressed when we were discussing as a student group was the problem with that narrative is obviously it creates this idea that, well, if you're poor, then it's your fault, right? You didn't have the right genetics, you didn't have the skills. But when we know that there are all these historical injustices, when we know that there's all this inequality in the world, the kind of conclusion that you reach with a narrative like that is that, well, you know, African Americans in the United States must simply be stupider, right? They didn't reach to the top the way white Americans did. So wouldn't you agree that that sort of narrative kind of encourages the idea that the people at the top automatically must have deserved it, and the people at the bottom, well, it's just kind of their problem. There's something wrong with them.
So I start off by saying that the truth might be extremely ugly, and we should never say that's not true because it doesn't sound like something we want to say. That's just hard reality. That doesn't mean that the harsh, cold reality is, or the harshest, coldest story is true, but you should always be open to the harsh and the cold.
To some extent, he's saying people from the African continent are stupid, which is absolutely crazy. Because, in a sense, he's saying, I'm possibly stupid, which is not necessarily the case. And so, I think he could have found a way to say maybe people lack the motivation. If people had more motivation and drive, I think that would have been way better. Just straight off saying people are lazy, ignoring other important factors, I would say that's very discriminatory and disturbing.
Now, what I'd say is if we're going to talk about, like, is this view dangerous? I would say, well, there's the danger of people saying, oh, there's nothing that can be done. On the other hand, there's the danger of people saying, oh, there's nothing I can do. And agency-focused stories do, on the one hand, they do mean that people are going to be less interested in helping other people, but they also mean that people are going to be more interested in helping themselves. And what I would say is, if you actually want to help yourself, it is much more productive to focus on what can I do in the system.
I was kind of shocked. If anything, I mean, the thing I was most shocked about was the fact that there weren't more reactions from other students towards what he just said. Because, you know, in my head, I was just like, is this like a flat-out endorsement of the idea of the superiority of other races or something? Because that's what it sounded like to me. I can't really think of any other way to interpret what he said. But to push back on that a little bit, I mean, you know, it's not like you can, you know, change society with the wave of a wand. You can't go around and tell people, well, you should just work harder. And ultimately, the solution would be in structural changes, right? You have to actually change something about society if you want societal culture to be different. So would you not agree that the solution would be something more like investing in these underprivileged communities instead of just telling them to work harder? Because, I mean, that's not going to do anything, right?
So I'm a big fan of one structural change, which is open borders, right? Focusing on actual poverty and people who are trapped in poor countries and are totally willing and able to move but aren't allowed to. But, again, to say, you know, systemic changes are the ones that work. Are they? What are actually the examples of systemic changes working? On the other hand, if you were to say, like, what is the evidence for individual agency? There we can, you know, I think you probably personally know many people who have individual agency and did start off in an unfavorable situation and by their own actions actually did solve their problem.
Well, basically, we're saying we should just accept what he said and not worry about it so much, but rather be optimistic and look for happiness or success in other areas.
I think we didn't challenge him quite enough because, you know, as we saw, you know, the professor was kind of dodging a little bit. I think if you know, me as well as other students had pressed him more, we could have probably got him to say what he meant by these really dodgy, strange answers.
These are realistic things, and I assure you, they do work for a lot of people.
Sarah, do you agree? Are they realistic things?
So I think it's very ironic because the speaker debate earlier, we kind of made a note that there was not a mention of of the refugees or people who come from underprivileged places, basically, in communities, and people from wars and these areas, which, by the way, we're in middle of a displacement crisis. I'm talking about a very realistic thing that happens every day to millions of people around the world. It's not because they are lazy. It's not because they can't work hard. No, they do work really hard. In fact, they work harder than me and maybe probably all of us here, because they have to repeat high school 3-4 times in different places because the degrees are not accepted in one place than another. Even when they reach EU or they reach a country that does give them asylum or some like refuge, basically, they have legal barriers. And I'm saying that no matter how hard you work, you still won't be able to get to the top. So for those people, where is their place?
Thank you for bringing that up. You know, when you look at people who have gone through life journeys like that, you see grit, you see resilience, the ability to learn different languages, study repeatedly. You know, those skills are skills that we don't value enough when we think about what is merit. And so we have to also question what we mean by someone who has merit. And when we look at the world today and in the future, what kind of leaders do we want to see? What kind of individuals do we want leading our organizations?
I think we can all agree here that hierarchies are inevitable, correct? Like, no matter how hard we try, there will always be some level of hierarchy somewhere. Even under a communist system, there is ironically a hierarchy in many of these countries. So I think the question really is then, what do you want these hierarchies to be? You want them to be of competence, right? Because that's the best hierarchy possible. You don't want to be based on tribe or based on race or based on ethnicity, which unfortunately we've seen a lot in the Middle East. So then I think the question is for Professor Markovits and Dr. Luthra, how do we best achieve that? I don't really think DEI is the best way forward for that, because I don't think that basically lowering the standard is going to achieve competence in many ways. I think we've seen, for example, at UCLA Medical School recently, where they've been sued for lowering the standard, quote unquote, from the dean of admissions. She literally said, we're lowering the standard for African Americans and Hispanics. I don't think that's a good way to get competence out of hierarchies. And I think it's better to kind of have a high standard and help people achieve that standard from there, but not to lower the standard. So what is your way to achieve these hierarchies of competence?
With respect to defending DEI programs, there are a whole series of ways in which people who are attacking these programs are misunderstanding how there can be a real justification for identity-based admissions. So here are some of them. First of all, if you have overcome significant disadvantage, then whatever your level of accomplishment at the moment, it's likely that you're more able and more capable than somebody who has the same level of accomplishment without overcoming significant disadvantage. The second point, there are 1,000 ways in which people underestimate, this goes to the point that you just made, applicants based on their identities. And therefore, there's a reason to correct for the underestimation that the decision maker will make of certain candidates based on their identities, and that requires having some kind of an adjustment. A third point, it's very complicated what a meritorious applicant is. So the scion of an old established family that has a monopoly in some trade and that will go into the monopoly business and extend it into the next generation, even if that person has the highest test scores and grades imaginable, that person's expected social surplus is negative, because what they're going to do is they're going to extend monopoly power into the future. Whereas the person who comes from an underserved community and will take the post in a job, in a school, and do the job and bring the job to an underserved community may have an enormously large social product, even if their incoming test scores are much lower. And so if we measure merit based on the expected social product of the graduate, you get a very different ranking of who has merit and who doesn't.
I think that was a really important perspective that helped kind of shape the debate. Not just the fact that diversity is good, but that sometimes your identity can be a merit in of itself. You can bring a new perspective, or perhaps you can provide more social good. I think that was the thing that I stressed about social good, the idea that, if you bring all these benefits to society, you're ultimately going to provide more for your community than like the same suburban white guy who's already applied 30 times, to this program, who actually is going to have a bigger impact on his community.
One thing I want to say that's important and a little bit more critical. Notice much of this conversation about diversity and inclusion has been about identity categories other than income and class. But my own judgment is that the biggest form of structural inequality in the United States right now is economic and class-based. And it is often the case that DEI programs, as administered, produce a kind of ideological cover for continued exclusion based on class. And that's an injustice and something that needs to be corrected.
Does meritocracy by design then create a system of winners and losers?
So I think, of course, it's going to be a system of winners and losers, just as any other system is going to provide you with a system of winners and losers, right? I think that life, by definition, is going to be competitive. I think, similarly, by definition, the people who are willing to compete and willing to put additional efforts will always, to some extent, rise to the top. Does it mean it's going to be on the same scale? Of course, no, right? However, there will still be a level of success that he will be able to achieve based on his own effort and his own ability to pull himself up, right? But I think trying to do anything else in terms of quotas, in terms of all these other methods, is actually unfair. Ra'ed said something that kind of caught my attention, right? When he talked about the UCLA case, etc. And I actually believe this was something that was quite wrong. These decisions made by these medical schools in the United States actually very badly disadvantage the Asian American students, as well as the Arab American students and the Indian American students, whether they be from the same economic state as the African American students, whether they be even poorer, whether they be first-class immigrants. These students who are achieving, by average, much higher scores and working much harder and really dedicating their lives to the field of studying medicine to get a high MCAT score were actually rejected, to the extent where there was actually a instance where an Indian man shaved his head and pretended to be black and got in with a below average GPA to medical school. And this is something that we have to understand is wrong. How in this scenario would you put a finger on the scale, as you said, and how in this scenario would you try to help those with less opportunities get an upper hand without disadvantaging those from classes that are overrepresented, for example, Asians?
The way I see it, I'm going to build on what Daniel said earlier around intersectionality. I think when we look at diversity and when we look at these quotas targets, most of the time it's based on certain particular dimensions without taking into account particularly class, socioeconomic background in particular. I think we need more nuanced discussions here and how we look at who we're giving opportunities to, how we're leveling the playing field. And unfortunately, that's not how DEI efforts have played out. It's been very focused on certain dimensions, and that has then created the us versus them, the zero-sum game. This is all a pizza and pie. You give someone one piece and there's less for everybody else. But when we start putting on the table the intersectional lens of what things like and dimensions like socioeconomic background and class have to, and the influence that has, then we start getting a more nuanced picture of what we're looking at and who actually needs to be lifted, who actually needs support, whether it's in early education or in terms of opportunities further on in life. So I think there's an opportunity here, and we're having the right discussions, because the way DEI has been played out, it hasn't taken this necessarily into account in most parts of the world.
I didn't have any guttural response to any of the speakers because all of them were really taking a very safe approach, except for, of course, Caplan, who wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers with his opinions. Of course, him I did disagree with to an extent as well. I had some agreement, some disagreement, etc. But all of them were taking a very safe approach, and that kind of made it a bit boring. I wanted to see some real discussions, not just we need structural change. Everybody knows that. I think this is something, this is a given. We know that there is inequality. We know that the life isn't fair. What is your way of addressing this? What is your way of fixing this, for example, right? I think we didn't get any of this at all. I think all of them just said, oh, we need to have more inclusion, but not quotas, but still more inclusion, but we need systems.
And I actually want to ask this to Dr. Khanna, because you said in one interview that technocracy is meritocratic, and you made the claim that technocracy is compatible with democracy. But I want to, question you more on that. Is meritocracy actually compatible with democracy? Because one of the fundamental premises of democracy is that it requires a certain kind of equality. When it comes to meritocracy, do you create that system of winners and losers? You create a certain kind of inequality.
When I'm talking about technocracy, which has traditionally been defined as, say, rule by the elites or experts, let's say experts. And experts, therefore, you can measure by their competence. But in a technocratic society, you're looking for people who have certainly academic excellence, looking for people who are, let's say, virtuous in the sense that they are public-spirited and plan to fulfill their duties in the public interest. And this gets partially, just as a tangent to Daniel's point about those that have overcome a certain degree of hardship, are probably likely to use their potential for the betterment of society rather than to entrench a monopoly. And you're looking for people who have administrative competence, the capability of running a bureaucracy or organization. So 3 things to be clear: academic excellence, public spiritedness, and administrative capability and ability. These kinds of things you would have in a technocratic state. That does not in any way, shape, or form make it incompatible with democracy. To the contrary, I would hope that any regime, any society would want to see their leaders exhibit these 3 and other characteristics. It's by no means limited to undemocratic societies. In Singapore, it's very clear. In, again, going back to ancient China to modern China, Japan, every country in the world. It really comes down to the role of impartiality and independence of the civil service within the political system. If it's elite capture by a political party or faction or partisan group or family or dynasty that simply dictates politics, and you have a revolving door of people coming in and out and there's no measure of competence, well, then you're going to get the kind of regime that isn't really delivering in the public interest. Where if you have an independent civil service that transcends administrations and is produced and, again, tested for and trained based upon the desire to have competent people occupying those positions, then I believe you're going to have a better outcome in terms of governance, and you're going to have a positive technocratic system.
But
go ahead.
I want to kind of pivot it towards Dr. Caplan's earlier point about open borders. So, because we accept winners and losers will exist in any system, particularly a meritocracy, but I believe that the state, particularly on the local level, has the responsibility, or at least communities have the responsibility to help those who lose out. Right, Dr. Markovits talks a lot about it in his book about the middle class being hollowed out in the past 20 years because of globalization and automation. And a big fault of American society in the past 20 years has been not accounting for these people who lost out to globalization. But under your paradigm of open borders, do you think the state has any responsibility, or at least even the local government has responsibility to provide welfare to anyone who loses out? Or do you think it's like a dog eats dog world, where if you lose out, you get no welfare and you have to kind of stick it on your own?
So I don't like the dog-eat-dog language, but yeah, that actually is my view. So the idea that you should go and take care of people because technology has made their job obsolete, it's like, well, this is the kind of thing where you should exercise individual responsibility and find a new job, and of course, plan ahead and save so that you're taking care of yourself. Similarly, I would say there's really no fundamental difference between globalization and technological change. I don't think actually the transformation of the economy has been anywhere near that large, and I think the amount of automation that has occurred has actually been up to, in the last 20 years, has actually been underwhelming. So it's also important to understand what the basic facts are. But stepping back, the way that people are so focused about losses to people who are very rich by world standards, who happen to be born in rich countries, and yet have almost no interest in the fate of 120 million people who have been displaced on Earth. This is just a very strange and inverted moral priority, which you shouldn't agree with, regardless of whether you're utilitarian or you believe in meritocracy or any number of other philosophies. The interesting comment was, is it possible for someone who's a refugee to ever rise to the top? And then you were talking about the plight of the children of recent immigrants. And I'd say here we actually have some of the best evidence for the failure of meritocracy, evidence I've worked on myself, where we see that the children of immigrants have a lot more upward mobility than the children of natives. Right now, if you're thinking this is all about investment of parents and so on, this is puzzling because those immigrants don't have the same resources to invest in their kids. Just being fluent in the language of the country they're in turns out to be an enormous gain, which on the one hand says, well, it wasn't very meritocratic for their parents because they were disadvantaged by not being born in the right country. On the other hand, it also means that one generation is all it takes to get a very large boost and to reverse a lot of those harms.
Just to push back on that, because you're using the nation, we're forgetting we're living in nation states, right? The United States, for example, has a responsibility. But bear in mind, the U.S. has a responsibility to its citizens, right? It doesn't have of course, every human has worth, but as a government, you have a responsibility to Americans first, obviously, right? Any country has, even Qatar, which you extol the virtues of, has those policies, right? Of course, they protect Qataris from losing out through rentier contracts and through rentier social contracts and all these sort of things. Let's say you were president of the United States, do you think it'd be fair for you to go out there and say that we have a responsibility towards everyone, and if you lose by globalization, well, sucks to you?
So here it's important to distinguish between responsibility and responsibility to help someone and a responsibility to avoid harming them. So if you were to say, well, as a parent, isn't your responsibility to make sure that your kids are doing well? It's like, okay, but what are the limits on that? Is it okay to go and slash the tires of people that are competing with my kids for jobs? Like, no. Actually, the very fact that I'm their parent is a reason for me to exert self-control and say, I need to be very careful that I'm not mistreating people just because they are not my children. And I think this is actually the main problem in global policy, is that almost no government on earth sits around saying, are we being careful to be really fair to foreigners? It is not just a fault in the United States, it's a fault of every country that I've ever heard of. It is the right question to be asking. Are you being fair to foreigners? Say no country is really fair to foreigners, but there are different degrees of unfairness.
I just want to weigh in on 2 points. On the question of the balance of obligation between the domestic middle class and the global poor, Bryan, you make an excellent point, and that obviously the plight of the 120 million displaced persons, and just broadly the plight of the billion people who are still living on roughly $2 a day, is in material terms the most morally pressing question on the planet. And it's callous to deny that. At the same time, politics is a really complicated matter, and not just practically but morally. And groups that form together to form a state have a legitimate interest in their own solidarity. And it's really difficult to know how to balance those two against each other. And it's simply not the case that any state in this broken world can act in a way that is free of any legitimate complaint. And my private view is that right now the rich nations of the world are not doing nearly enough for the global poor. And they are, in that sense, doing too much for their own displaced middle class. But I also believe that the rich nations of the world are not doing nearly enough for their own displaced middle class, and they're doing too much for their own super rich. The other point I want to make that's also very, very important here is that everybody's return, everybody who acts individually in the most effortful and most responsible way, does so against the background of a set of structures that they did not choose and did not control. And it's just nonsense to talk as if we can allocate responsibility to an individual or a system and tell people to pick yourself up, or we can say if we give you, the incentives are always given against a backdrop, and that's true at such a level of depth that we don't know. So let me give you one very concrete example. This goes to the question of hierarchy. Yes, hierarchies are inevitable. The question is how spiky they're going to be. And we can choose this in every industry. So in medicine, for example, every rich country of the world has way too many specialists and way too few general practitioners, nurses, nutritionists, and health aides. And if we reallocated our medical budgets away from the specialists and in favor of general practitioners, nurses, and health aides, two things would happen. One is our populations would be a lot healthier, because specialists are an incredibly inefficient way to deliver healthcare to a population. The other thing that would happen is the wage structure in medicine would be much more egalitarian. And there'd be much less need to get into UCLA Medical School because the returns to being a doctor would be a lot lower, and the returns to being a nurse would be a lot higher, and we'd both have more economic equality in the labor market and a much better healthcare system.
Look, you're talking about sort of the state's responsibility and the government's responsibility. I just want to personalize it a little bit, okay? So for my guests here on the panel, for those of you who have children, did your definition of success change when you had children? And also, how far would you go for your children to give them an advantage? Parag, I'll start with you.
It's a great question. I think as children age, and they develop their own personal interests and worldviews and preferences, because you love them and because you hopefully can create, or you live in an environment where there is opportunity for them, you simply want them not to succeed by whatever preconceived notion you may have or whatever expectations your social segment may have for them, but rather you simply want to encourage them to do the best they can and be the best they can be in whatever field of endeavor they are most inclined towards. So that's how my personal view has evolved. And then,
so how far would you go?
It really depends on if I even have the capacity to do so, depending on their interest. If my son wants to be a professional soccer player, there's almost nothing I can do whatsoever. He will have to succeed based on the merit, his own skill, his athletic skill, and I cannot.
But if you were friends with the dean of a university, would you go in and put in a good word?
Yes.
All right, there you go. Brian.
So I only have 4 children, and I'd say the main thing that has changed from being a parent is wanting my kids to give me a lot of grandkids. This is no joke.
Is that how you measure success then?
Yeah, this is the main thing that I push. I want at least 4 kids from every kid.
But how far would you go to give them an advantage?
How far would I go? I would push them to the extent that I think they deserved it. I would not go and lie to a friend and say, go and give my son a job. He's not really very good, but he's my son, so do a favor for me.
Okay, Poornima.
So my children are third-generation immigrant children. So my parents left India in the early 80s. I grew up in the UK and moved to Singapore, and my children have grown up in Singapore and in Denmark. So we're a globally mobile family. We don't really know where home is. And my children are privileged, and I make sure that they know that they have a lot of privilege and advantages, just simply because my parents worked really hard to give us advantages, earned advantages, fair advantages. And my parents come from lower middle class backgrounds, and they've worked really hard to try to get us into better educational institutions, providing tutoring, all of that. And so we moved up the socioeconomic ladder. And now we, of course, then have made choices. They're conscious choices. My children go to an international school. We live in a country where it's not a native language of ours. You could argue that, yeah, sure, you'd send your kids there, but it's also a real advantage, and I want them to know that. And the only thing I do tell my children is that you have an advantage, you have privilege. Make sure that you're lifting others along the way and that you're very grateful for that advantage.
Daniel, how far would you go to give them advantage? Would you speak to the dean of a university?
So my love of my children exceeds my moral principles. And if one of my children committed a murder, I would bury the body. But I also think 2 other things. The first is that's why we have systems. And we have systems in place so that people, among other things, can love their children without actually doing wrong. And so I would very much want the dean of the university to angrily show me the door if I tried to do this thing. And this is the balance between structure and responsibility. And we need structures that make it possible for people to act according to their own concerns and not unsettle the system. So that's the first. The second thing is just what do I want for my children? I want them to have the right amount of existential self-hatred. That is to say, I want them to love themselves and to believe that they're important, and also to believe that they're a member of a fallen species, and that they have unjustified advantages, and that they're capable of wrong, and to have the right set of values. So hopefully they'll never commit the murder and force me to bury the body.
Just briefly from all of you guys, do you agree that with what Daniel was saying, that if one of his children committed a murder, he would bury the body? Meaning, do you expect your parents to go to the ends of the earth to kind of give you that advantage? Yes or no?
No.
No?
No.
No?
At the expense of societal institutions, no.
But can I just observe, that's possibly because you've been raised with the right amount of existential self-hatred, right? I hope my children wouldn't want that of me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Doha Debates. Thank you to our speakers, to our students, and all of you for watching and listening. We've explored bold ideas, challenged assumptions, and open space for understanding with respect and curiosity at the center. But the conversation doesn't end here. Now it's your turn. What do you think? You can share your thoughts, your questions, your perspectives. We're listening.
I really appreciated the comment by Daniel Markovits when he was saying that there has to be a certain amount of self-hatred that people need to have. I don't think that makes somebody a pessimist or a negative person. I think it just holds you accountable and holds you responsible in your dealings with people. It makes sure that, okay, you can work hard, and yes, okay, you want to live in a meritocratic society, but you also have a responsibility, kind of owe it to people to make sure that, okay, yes, the world cannot be fair, but we can work hard on making sure that your actions or what you're privileged with doesn't harm people. At least we could do that. So I think that the comment about the right amount of self-hatred really resonates with me. Yeah.
I feel weird saying it, but I'm always a person that really dislikes the idea of like it's only your own responsibility. So I was coming here saying like this is not gonna change. But even with, that I don't agree with Professor Bryan. He did bring up a point that maybe I'm like blaming the system too much. Like I do accept that I've been doing less towards work. I've been feeling more demotivated, and in that sense, I lost responsibility. So in that sense, I think I learned that it is necessary to be responsible and put some pressure on yourself in order for the systems to work. If I'm not like trying a bit, at least the system that's trying to help me will never succeed in helping me. So I think I'm living like kind of surprised that I changed my mind in a little bit in that sense.
I don't believe in failure being a dead-end street. I believe that you can fail a number of times, but if you're truly committed to changing your situation and making life better for yourself, then indeed your individual agency plays a key role in influencing that.